Strange but true historical events aren't always well known to the general population, especially outside the immediate area where the event took place. That doesn't mean they're not important stories in history, and sometimes they have an impact on us to this very day. Reports were very convincing, even to the British, but entirely fake. It was a double agent, but the British had no idea who he was. That mystery was solved when Juan came forward. Juan was an unassuming Spanish civilian in his 30s. He'd fought in the Spanish Civil War, but claimed he never fired a single bullet, and grew an extreme dislike of totalitarianism. When he saw the rise of an ideology that he hated in Germany, he offered his services as a double agent to the British in 1939. He was turned down. Juan had no connections to Germany or Britain, didn't speak English, and didn't seem like he would be of any use as a spy. Most double agents tend to, at the very least, already be spies, and most don't enter such a complicated situation willingly. It would have been natural for the British to be skeptical of Juan. But Juan didn't give up his dream of being a spy for the British. Instead, he offered his services to the Germans. He claimed to be a member of the Spanish government who was heading on a business trip to London. He would be able to provide valuable intelligence to the Germans, and the Germans eagerly accepted. For years, Juan wrote authentic-looking reports about the UK based entirely on information gathered from magazines in his local library, advertisements about the country, and other publicly available information. Remarkably, this was enough to convince the Germans. By the time he approached the British again in 1942, he was a valuable asset. Juan played an important part in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. The Germans believed he had a network of almost 30 spies feeding him information, all of which indicated the Normandy invasion was a decoy. In fact, the network was entirely a figment of Juan's imagination. His information was so convincing that he actually managed to convince Germany's high command to turn around troops that were heading towards Normandy, because he insisted that the real fight would take place elsewhere. After the war, Juan moved to Venezuela, but feared his life was in danger due to the amount of German officers that had moved there. He faked his passing, leaving behind his wife and children in Spain, and would remain in hiding until the 1980s. Juan would eventually write an autobiography detailing the strange but true story of how he came to be decorated by both sides of the war. But it's a story that's still unknown to most today, despite its importance. The Raising of Chicago is a weird but true history story that takes place in the 1850s and 60s. It was an incredible feat of engineering to save a city that was sinking into the swampy area it was built on. Before this point, flooding came with every rainstorm, and waterborne diseases infected 1 in every 20 people. Chicago had a choice to either abandon the city or lift it out of the swamp. Chicago was located only a few feet above Lake Michigan, and the water level was very close to the surface beneath the city. That meant that whenever it rained, the streets would become clogged with water, and the mud would swallow people, horses, and buggies. A proper sewage and storm water system was needed, but there wasn't enough space between the street level and the water table for one to be installed. The decision was made to make the space. Over the course of several years, an incredible yet strange historical event took place. Streets, buildings, and entire city blocks were manually raised on jacks with thousands of workers pumping in unison to make sure the buildings remained level. All the while, the businesses that worked out of the buildings remained open. Other buildings were transported by rollers to the edge of town and replaced with more modern-looking buildings as Chicago tried to update its image as a city of the future. Eventually, the entire city was lifted between 4 and 14 feet into the air. New foundations were put in place, and the city finally got the sewage system it desperately needed. Chicago remains safely raised above the swampland it was once built on. New developments have taken place over the centuries, especially after the Great Chicago Fire, but all built on the foundations made during this historic event. An unusual historical event took place on the streets of Dublin on the 18th of June, 1875. One of the most damaging fires that ever took place in the city took place that evening, with a river of flaming liquid spilling through the streets and causing everybody who touched it to catch fire. Homes and businesses were destroyed, but remarkably, nobody lost their lives due to burns or smoke inhalation. However, alcohol poisoning caused by the event was much more damaging. The Dublin whiskey fire began sometime before 8:30 p.m. at Malone's Malt and Storehouse at Chambers Street. The initial cause of the fire remains a mystery to this day, but before long, the heat was enough to cause the 5,000 barrels of whiskey stored there to erupt. The alcohol burst onto the streets, carrying the fire with it. Sources describe it as running like lava through the streets. Stopping the flow was a challenge, because adding water to the blaze would only make the stream of alcohol flow faster. In the end, the fire department dammed the streets with a mixture of sand and horse waste until the liquid could not flow any further, and attention turned to putting out the buildings that were already ablaze. This wasn't a particularly well-off area, with lots of houses built very close together, made of very flammable materials. Entire streets were completely demolished, and there was a fear that people would have lost their lives if they were trapped inside. Miraculously, everybody managed to get out. At the time, livestock like pigs lived in the streets, and it's thought the panic caused by the animals was one of the first alerts many people got. It's possible this strange history story could have been much more devastating without the animals. Word of the fire spread faster than the flames itself. People from across the city gathered with pots, pans, hats, and shoes to collect the spilled whiskey from the streets. Some even scooped up the burning liquid with their bare hands. Dozens of people were taken to the hospital with alcohol poisoning, and 13 people lost their lives. The fire was one of the most destructive in Dublin's history. The cost of the alcohol alone would be about 6 million euros in today's money, and the mayor set up a fund to help people who lost everything in the flames. It's definitely one of the strangest historical events that isn't discussed much today. Strange and unusual causes for war have been scattered throughout history, but one of the strangest things to almost cause a devastating conflict was a gardening project. This project took place in the Joint Security Area that separated North and South Korea in 1976. The incident claimed the lives of 2 American servicemen and led to the laying of the military demarcation line that now clearly separates the two countries. Since the end of the war, the Joint Security Area was a small bubble where soldiers from both sides of Korea and the US operated. It was a surreal, intense environment during this period of history, as soldiers from either side were far from friendly with one another. But everyone knew that a small personal fight could snowball into something much bigger. The United Nations Command Checkpoint 3 was the closest checkpoint to North Korean territory, and was described as the loneliest checkpoint. It was kept under the watchful eye of Operation Post 5, but between the two posts was a poplar tree. In the summer, when the tree was at full bloom, the checkpoint was almost completely obscured from view. The strange but important historical event began with the US and South Korean engineers being sent to trim the tree. As was the norm in this surreal environment, a small North Korean force appeared on the other side of the bridge of no return, where years later prisoners were exchanged and which today crosses the demarcation line. The North Korean lieutenant called for the trimming to stop and threatened violence. The American captain in charge ignored the threats. The lieutenant acted upon the threats. Heavy weaponry wasn't allowed in the Joint Security Area, so the North Korean soldiers attacked with axes that had been dropped by those working on the tree. In a matter of minutes, they claimed the lives of Captain Arthur Boniface and platoon leader First Lieutenant Mark Barrett. Knowing that anything could trigger a full-scale war, the American and South Korean soldiers at the scene did not fire back. In Washington, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and President General Ford debated what to do. Kissinger was in favor of fighting fire with fire and attacking the barracks of the perpetrators. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, with what was dubbed Operation Paul Bunyan. The Americans and South Koreans returned to the site of the Poplar Tree with a tremendous show of force. Military aircraft patrolled the skies. Soldiers stood at the bridge of no return, and it looked very much like they were prepared for war. On the other side, the North Koreans set up heavy weaponry ready to attack. In one of the weirdest operations in history, there would only be one casualty in Operation Paul Bunyan, that of the Poplar Tree. The tree was cut down to a stump. Despite the show of military strength, neither side attacked one another. Soldiers who were there that day believed there was a 50-50 chance this operation would cause the war to start up again. Thankfully, both sides walked away from the disaster after one of the most surreal and strange moments in history. An important historical event took place near Simi Valley, California, in 1959. It's not well known today, but is still having an impact on those that live in the area. The partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor at an experimental facility had the capability of being worse than Chernobyl, and is today believed to be one of the worst nuclear accidents the world has ever seen. Exactly how bad it was will possibly always remain a mystery, due to the government cover-up. The accident took place at Santa Susana Field Laboratory. The laboratory was responsible for experimenting with different types of rockets that would contribute to the space race, and those that grew up near the facility were used to the sounds of booms coming from the facility. It was also home to one of 5 experimental nuclear reactors that were built in the late 1950s. This reactor used sodium as a coolant for its fuel rods. Sodium was pumped in a one-way system past the 43 nuclear fuel rods that powered the generator. These rods needed to be kept cool, otherwise a meltdown would take place. The most common coolant these days is water or heavy water, but the facility used liquid sodium for the job. The pump itself also needed to be kept cool, and an oil-like substance called tetralin was used as a coolant. In late 1958 and the first half of '59, there were a number of incidents with coolant leakage being a relatively well-known problem, but the experiments continued. These experiment cycles were called runs. Run 13 took place at the end of June and the start of July, and temperature irregularities were noticed. The smell of tetralin was reported, and it's believed the pump coolant was leaking, but the experiments continued. It was in run 14 that the partial meltdown really took place. Tetralin had seeped into the pipes that supplied liquid sodium and blocked the pipe. The sodium couldn't get to the nuclear rods, and the rods weren't being kept cool. The run was eventually shut off before too much damage was done, but radioactive particles were released into the environment to stop a full meltdown. Repairs took place to the reactor, and the experiments eventually restarted a little over a year later, but no cleanup took place. The government insisted contamination hadn't been that bad, but whistleblowers 20 years later revealed the truth. Radiation levels at the site were thousands of times higher than background radiation. The area surrounding the field laboratory remains contaminated to this day. The companies that now own the areas are supposed to have it cleaned up, but there have been multiple pushbacks against this. In 2018, a forest fire burned through the area, and smoke and ash transported radioactive material into the communities that surround the site. Cancers in the area are unusually common, and it's believed this disturbing historical event and other small accidents at the site are still causing issues to this day. Kutna Hora in Czechia is home to one of the creepiest places on Earth, the Bone Church. Like the surrounding area, the church has a deep and rich history, and is the final resting place of over 40,000 people, and draws in thousands of tourists each year. The church was built in 1142 and began life as a monastery. It remained an unassuming structure until the 13th century, when an abbot made a holy pilgrimage to Jerusalem. According to legend, this abbot went to Jerusalem and brought back a handful of soil from the Holy Land and placed it in the cemetery. Once word got out about this, people flocked in their thousands to secure their place at the monastery, believing that the soil from the Holy Land would ensure them a better passage to heaven. It was a great honor to be buried at the Bone Church, with people from around Bohemia fighting for their place. Then, in the 14th century, the Black Plague swept through Europe and decimated much of the population. The cemetery quickly began filling up with plague victims, and soon the ground had become too full. Not wanting to turn people away from this holy resting site, the monastery created an area in the basement and agreed to store the bones of the deceased there. For centuries, these bones remained in the basement. That was until 1870, when František Rent was tasked with arranging the bones in an artistic display. Rent took the job seriously and arranged the skeletons of 40,000 people into pyramids, chandeliers, candelabras, and even a family crest. The photographs of the area speak for themselves and give an insight into the macabre tastes of the 19th century. The town of Parikkala, Finland, is home to a forest filled with over 550 creepy sculptures that were all created by one artist, Veijo Ronkainen. Up until his passing in 2010, Veijo was a self-professed recluse, and although his sculptures attracted thousands of visitors each year, he never left his house to greet them. Instead, he left a visitor's book and asked that people write him a note. Born in 1944, Veijo began living life as a recluse very early on. He had a job at a paper mill, and with his first paycheck, he bought apple seeds and a bag of concrete. From here, he started his sculpture garden that quickly spiraled out of control and ended up with over 550 creations. Academics and artists have tried to study Veijo's work, but have been unable to come up with an explanation for his work. Upon entering Veijo's sculpture garden, visitors are met with an array of creepy sculptures that sit in the realm of the Uncanny Valley. There's something strangely human about the sculptures, yet at the same time, visitors are met with an uneasy feeling, almost as if they are being watched. The 550 sculptures are made in an array of positions. Some of them are posed in yoga stances, while others are made to resemble couples sitting together. To add an extra layer of creepiness to the sculpture park, Veijo used human teeth in some of his works, and added sound effects to mimic human activity. In an interview, Veijo was asked why he hadn't allowed museums to display his work, and he said, quote, that I must check with the statues first, but they've always said no. Up until his passing in 2010, Veijo continued creating sculptures and avoided human contact as much as possible. His park is open to visitors, but it's not a place you'd want to visit after dark. Off the coast of Mexico City sits an island so creepy and terrifying that tourists have been warned about the dangers of visiting it. The Island of the Dolls is home to thousands of creepy dolls hanging from trees and dotted around the island. If the dolls themselves weren't creepy enough, nature has begun to reclaim the land, decaying the dolls and growing around them, adding an eerie air to the island. Legend has it that the first doll was placed there by Don Julian Santana Barrera, the only person who lived on the island, to placate the spirit of a young girl who had passed away there. Barrera had abandoned his family and moved to the desolate island to live off the land and become closer to God. He would sometimes make trips to the neighboring island to sell his vegetables and preach the word of God. While the residents of the island didn't mind Barrera selling his goods, they became annoyed at his paranoid preachings and forbade him from ever setting foot on their island again. This sent Barrera into a deep spiral of paranoia and pushed him further into his religious fanaticism. One day, Barrera left a doll in dedication to a girl who had passed away on the island, believing that this would placate her spirit and protect him. But Barrera's paranoia and isolation got the better of him, and he began believing that one doll simply wasn't enough. In the coming months and years, Barrera began hanging up thousands of dolls, hoping that each new doll would make the spirit happy. Some stories state that Barrera was haunted by whisperings from the ghost saying, "I want my doll," causing him to leave more dolls as offerings to the spirit. Barrera continued leaving dolls until his passing in 2001, leaving behind one of the scariest places on Earth with an even creepier backstory. After his passing, Doll Island became a tourist attraction, and those who are interested in the macabre can hop on a boat and see the island for themselves. Many locals aren't too keen on visiting Doll Island, as it's said that at night, the dolls come alive and whisper to each other. Mansfield Reformatory was constructed between 1886 and 1910, and boasts stunning Gothic architecture and creepy dark history. The prison was built on the site of a Civil War camp, which was home to hundreds of political prisoners, and those who defied the opposition. When the first 150 prisoners were transferred to Mansfield, hopes were high as the prison's administration aimed to create an environment where non-violent first-time offenders could do their time and receive rehabilitation. The reformatory also ensured that these prisoners were not exposed to the harsh realities of Columbus State Penitentiary, which may have institutionalized them and made them worse. This plan of reformation and rehabilitation worked for a while. That was until crime rates skyrocketed and violent offenders were sent to Mansfield due to overcrowding at other facilities. Over time, Mansfield too became overcrowded, and the mood of the prison quickly shifted and devolved. It wasn't long before the prison guards began treating the prisoners harshly, ignoring their initial hopes of rehabilitation. Those caught misbehaving and breaking prison rules would be subjected to inhumane punishments, such as electric shocks, isolation, and water tubes. The prisoners' lives were made even more miserable, as up to 3 men at a time were confined to one prison cell. These conditions allowed diseases to run rampant, and outbreaks were commonplace at Mansfield. Coupled together with the threat of violence, life was difficult for prisoners at Mansfield, and it's estimated that at least 200 people passed away due to disease or violence. Mansfield Reformatory was closed in 1990 due to the horrendous conditions that were brought to light, and a public outcry ensued. While the prison is now defunct, plenty of ghost hunters and paranormal investigators have visited the prison in an attempt to capture the ghostly goings-on. The most infamous room in the Mansfield Reformatory is simply called the chair room, after the only piece of furniture found there. Those who have visited claim that the chair room is haunted by a dark, malevolent spirit, and that the chair can often be heard being dragged around the floor when no one is in the room. One brave paranormal investigator sat in the chair and was quickly covered in deep scratches from the angry ghost. Visitors are warned against entering this room, as moving the chair or interacting with it will anger the ghost greatly. The ghost of Helen Gladkey, the wife of a warden, is also said to haunt the reformatory. In the 1950s, Helen was visiting her husband when she was involved in a freak accident which led to her passing. Her husband was devastated, and those who worked in the prison told stories of cold spots, the smell of sweet rose perfume, and whispers of Helen trying to talk to her husband. According to a 2011 investigation by amateur ghost hunter Paul Camper, there were at least 55 reports of paranormal activity in Manchester that year alone. That doesn't include the 43 haunting manifestations, 2 poltergeist sightings, 2 UFO reports, and 1 report of an evil course. Manchester is a city with a rich and dark history, and its streets have been home to outlaws, serial killers, and some of the scariest people to ever exist. During the Industrial Revolution, Manchester was the main hub for textiles and cotton, and as a result, became the main transport hub for those making their way north. As of 2021, Greater Manchester's population was home to over 2.2 million people, and hiding in each borough and area is a terrifying, haunted property with a chilling backstory. One of the most infamous haunted properties in Greater Manchester is Barlo Hall, located in Coralton. Barlo Hall was built during the 1200s and since then has gone through many renovations. According to historical records, in 1584, Barlo Hall was rebuilt and a mile-long passage was created, connecting the hall to Hough End Hall. There are also rumors of a priest's hole and numerous secret rooms and compartments for the Barlow family to hide in the event that an attack take place. The Barlow family called this hall home for many decades, setting up their lives here and cementing themselves as members of the community. Ambrose Barlow lived at the property and was well known in the area, but sadly, things would take a dark turn for Ambrose. In 1641, St. Ambrose Barlow was taken to the Lancaster jail on account of his Catholicism, and many people say that his spirit haunts the halls of Barlo Hall, seeking revenge on those who turned against him. Guests at the hall have reported seeing Ambrose wandering around aimlessly, and shocked guests have been given the fright of their lives when encountering him at night. In the late 1950s, the Lancaster family moved into Barlo Hall and cared for the property. Other guests at the infamous Barlo Hall have reported seeing the ghost of a headless woman walking the corridors in the north wing. There has also been poltergeist activity reported at the hall, with an entity dragging coal and other items between different rooms. It appears that no one has ever been physically harmed by the spirits that inhabit Barlo Hall, but that doesn't make it any less scary. It was 1942, just months after the traumatic damages that the Japanese had inflicted upon America. The aftermath of the Second World War brought nothing more than anger to everyone in the stateside. They sought retribution. Some residents, though seemingly unaffected, continued with their daily lives. One such person was Velva Lee Dixon, who ran her ordinary-looking doll shop on 714 Madison Avenue in New York City. Velva Lee's life was rich in history. She graduated from Stanford University, but didn't receive her Bachelor of Arts degree until many years later, because she had not returned a few books that she had lent from the university. In the mid-20s, she was employed at a bank in San Francisco, which was owned by her husband, Lee. In 1937, the couple opted to move to New York City, where Velva Lee would secure employment as a saleswoman for a doll store. She would later begin operating her own doll store, initially at 680 Madison Avenue, before relocating to 714 Madison Avenue. It was this doll shop that found itself stuck in a historical image. Here, Velva Lee catered to wealthy collectors and hobbyists who were interested in antique, foreign, and regional dolls. Lee handled the accounting records for his wife, and everything seemed to be going just well. But then in February of 1942, something caught the attention of the FBI. Wartime censors intercepted a letter talking about dolls due to their unusual contents. The letter supposedly came from a woman who lived in Portland, Oregon, and was making its way to someone in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The letter spoke of a doll hospital, and the writer's 3 Old English dolls that were sent for repairs. The words fishnets and balloons also made their way into the note. The intercepted letter was sent to cryptographers in the FBI laboratory. They found that the 3 Old English dolls may be referring to 3 warships, and the doll hospital was a shipyard where repairs were undertaken. The experts also deduced that the fishing nets were referring to submarine nets that protected ports on the West Coast, and the mention of balloons was cited as an intention to convey information about defense installations on the West Coast. After decrypting the letter, the FBI began to investigate to determine if the information was referring to United States defense matters, and if they were being transmitted to the opposing force. In the interim, another 4 letters were intercepted. They were addressed to the same individual with the notation "address unknown." The 4 persons whose names appeared on the letters were questioned. It was determined that the contents were accurate to their personal lives, interest in dolls, signatures, and names, but they denied ever sending the letters. One of the 4 letters also referred to the words "destroyed your" and the sentence "Mr. Shaw is ill and will be back to work soon." It became clear that this was in reference to the ship Destroyer Shaw, which had its bow blown off during the Pearl Harbor attack. It was being repaired at the shipyard of the West Coast and would be rejoining the fleet. Further investigation also revealed that the signatures that appeared on these letters were not authentic, but forgeries, which meant that the original signatures of each of these individuals, who shared a common interest in doll collection, were in the possession of the forger. One of the supposed letter writers who denied writing them directed the FBI to a New York City doll shop owned by the aforementioned Velva Lee Dickinson. An investigation found that it was her typewriter that was responsible for at least one of these letters, and that each of the 4 women's signatures corresponded with doll collections at the doll shop. The FBI also found something rather alarming. In the early to mid-1930s, Velva Lee was part of the Japan-American Society, and she had made frequent visits to the Japanese consulate in San Francisco. She also went to important social gatherings attended by Japanese Navy members. Velva Lee also visited the Nippon Club and Japanese Institute, where she cultivated a friendship with the Japanese Consul General and met with the Japanese Naval Attaché, Ichiro Yokoyama. It became clear quite quickly that this was a case of espionage, all of which was carried out from the front of an innocent-looking doll shop in New York City. Velva Lee was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law, which was 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Still, she maintained that it was her now deceased husband who was the traitor and not her. The letters were just too odd to be just about antiques and collections. Velva Lee was named the spy in the doll shop. This gaping mouth belonged to a sinister spectacle in Paris's Belle Époque. It was the Cabaret of Hell. The entity that marks the entrance is the jaws of a leviathan, the symbol of damnation. It was established in 1892 and stood as a unique feature. It wasn't just an iconic entertainment venue, but also the portal to the city's underbelly, with the fantastical and forbidden coming together. The Cabaret of Hell was established as a counterpart to the Cabaret of the Sky, which shared the same address. The man who created, directed, and hosted the twin enterprises was Antonin Alexander. The club was nothing less than eccentric. It attracted many onlookers, macabre lovers, and opposing forces. At the door stood a doorman dressed as Satan, who greeted customers with "Enter and be damned." Inside, patrons were served by waiters who were also dressed as devilish entities. The terminology within the establishment also coincided with the theme. If one wanted 3 black coffees spiked with cognac, they had to relay this to the bar as 3 seeping bumpers of molten sins and a dash of brimstone intensifier. The true essence of the cabaret lay in the exciting performances of singers, dancers, and other entertainers. They adorned costumes that were reminiscent of damnation and temptation. It was a true spectacle. The onstage performances went from sensual to incredibly grotesque, where the narratives balanced on the edge of social acceptance. The audience was a mix of travelers and locals who chose to revel in the scandalous nature that the establishment exuded. The entranceway of the Cabaret of Hell was not the only haunting design that the club took on. Inside, the ceilings were alive with creatures and entities of the underworld that greeted the patrons with outstretched claws and grim faces. Later, a competitor opened up called Cabaret of the Void, which specialized in the invocations of what may lie beyond the grave. The Cabaret of Heaven proposed mystical illusions, and the Cabaret of Hell was the club of magic tricks and the macabre. After the liberation of Paris, a supermarket that neighbored the establishments bought both of the counterparts, stripped them of their embellishments, and expanded them. By 1950, though, all traces of the portal to the underbelly were gone, and its existence was only confirmed through the remaining pictures and archival material. While this may look like an image taken from a science fiction film, it was a real event. This historical photograph was taken in October of 1930, when 54 people were boarding the HMA R101, a British airship. The story of R101, though, begins in the number 1 shed in the summer of 1930. It had been undergoing extensive modifications, which were needed after the blimp's previous trial flights. R101 and its counterpart R100 were known to lack the disposable lift that had been planned for the Imperial airship scheme of 1925. Those who were involved in the scheme discovered that both airships were not viable for commercial operation. The intentions were then passed to the newer ship, R102. The modifications to R101 to achieve the lift were a central bay and a gas bag. In September of 1930, the blimp was gassed and set afloat right in the shed. The ship was due to leave for Karachi later that month, when it would be carrying the Air Minister Lord Thompson of Cardington. The target date of this trip was on course, only for the wind to prevent R101 from leaving the shed until the morning of the 1st of October. At 6:30 a.m. that day, the blimp emerged from the shed and serenely made its way to the mast. By 4:30 that afternoon, the ship had slipped its mast and left Cardington. It headed south to London and turned east to follow the Thames to Essex, spending the night over the North Sea. A day later, it returned to its bay in Cardington after having spent over 17 hours in the air in smooth flying conditions. That evening, a conference was held to determine whether or not R101 should make the trip to India. It was determined that the new modifications had not taken the engines into consideration, and that allowing the ship to fly at full speed may result in failure. The maximum recommended speed at this point was cruising speed. Pressure mounted with the involvement of R101 after the Air Minister stated that he needed to go to India and back in time for the Imperial Conference that would take place on the 20th of October. And so the decision was made to let R101 embark on the India flight. Final preparations were being made, and the ship remained at the mast while the crew prepared themselves. A meteorologist, Giblet, was watching the weather forecast, ensuring that the conditions would be optimal for that day. But on the day that it was due to take flight, conditions over northern France were looking cloudy. On the 4th of October, R101 was due to take flight between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. By this time, wind conditions had increased drastically, and it was decided that the trip should be hurried along. And so, as pictured here, passengers began to board at 6:24 that afternoon, in the midst of rain and darkness. The ship began to cruise and headed past the shed it was once stored in. It headed west, saluting its hometown. It then headed southeast towards London, cruising at 1,500 feet high below the cloud base. By 8 p.m. that evening, R101 was making its way over London. When that picture was taken on the 4th of October in 1930, no one knew that this would be the ship's final voyage. Just past midnight, the blimp sent the following message, reading 2400 GMT, 15 miles southwest of Abbeville, speed 33 knots, wind 243 degrees 35 miles per hour. The message ended with, "Crew have settled down to watchkeeping routine." This would be the last message sent by the airship. At 2 a.m., it reached Beauvais and was spotted by witnesses struggling against the rolling winds. Its nose then pointed down, and it made a long and steep dive toward the ground. The dive was sufficient enough to cause engineers to lose balance, and for furniture from the smoking room to slide around. As the nose touched the ground, the now hot engine made contact with free gas from the most forward gas bags that had been recently installed. Flames consumed R101, reducing it to nothing more than an empty frame. Remaining as a haunting echo was this photograph of the boarding and final voyage of the HMA R101 before it met its destructive demise, with only a handful of survivors. The skewed window frames, decrepit shutters, and flaking roofs are not the aftermath of an earthquake or an abandoned town. In fact, 5 Points of New York City was bustling, but not in the way that one would hope. It was this place that was New York's most notorious urban neighborhood, teeming with crime, corruption, and poverty, and for many, heading to New York City was a dream come true. It offered residents the world's most supreme facilities, including theaters, restaurants, and gyms. Yet one place in Lower Manhattan served as an eyesore, contrasted against the prosperous Big Apple. It was the 19th century, a time in which 5 Points was poverty-stricken. The neighborhood was named for the intersection of 5 streets: Little Water, Orange, Mulberry, Cross, and Anthony. It was an appalling place to be, riddled with unsanitary conditions and high crime rates. Despite this, it does hold important significance for American history due to immigration, social challenges, culture, crime, and politics. 5 Points was the perfect example of the challenges that urban immigration was facing at the time. This image is reminiscent of the harsh realities of such a life. The crimes were so dreadful that they shaped most of American law practices today. 5 Points gained notoriety in the early 19th century. It was known for the squalid living conditions amidst the crime that took place there. Its origins were traced to the Collect Pond. After being polluted with industrial waste, the pond was filled in to create buildable land, which became 5 Points. Building over the polluted pond contributed to the disease-ridden conditions. Irish and Italian immigrants flocked to the area due to its affordability. It didn't take long for it to become the center of social vices and overcrowding. The affordability allowed low-income residents to live in the small, cramped apartments, which contributed to the overcrowding and worsening conditions. Typhus and cholera broke out in the neighborhood due to improper sewage systems. Initially, the area boasted vibrancy with music and dance, but soon gained its reputation as the dangerous slum of New York City. The area would also find itself ruled by self-proclaimed individuals such as John Morrissey. Morrissey was a member of the 5 Points gang, who earned his fame as a bare-knuckle boxer. Shockingly, he would later become a Democratic Party politician. Paul Kelly was another prominent gangster who founded the 5 Points gang. He was one of the most powerful criminals in New York City. It was his gang that produced the mafia leaders Lucky Luciano and Al Capone. William Poole, known as Bill the Butcher, was another popular leader. He founded and led the Bowery Boys, a gang that was the center of infamous activities like frequent violent confrontations with rivals and warfare. This neighborhood was named the place where the gangs lived, and included other notorious groups such as the 40 Thieves, the Daybreak Boys, and the Eastman Coin Collectors, among others. One famous man, Charles Dickens, was there to see it all. In his writings of first-hand accounts, he described what he saw. These descriptions include the pitch-dark stairs, trembling boards, and a wolfish den. He recounted that no ray of light or breath of air dares to enter the neighborhood. He spoke of ruined houses, wide gaps in the walls, and the world of vice and misery. Dickens had insisted on visiting 5 Points during a tour of America due to its mythical status at the time. The vintage photograph of the neighborhood encapsulated his words without fault. While she may look as though she's in pain or uncomfortable, actress Lois Collier isn't really trying on the Spanish boot. Her foot is merely slipped into a non-torturous replica. Lois was an American actress who played the role of Joanne Fletcher in Jungle Woman, a 1944 Reginald LeBorg film. It isn't the history of Lois that this photograph concerns, though, but rather the replica that she finds her foot in. The Spanish boot was one horrific torture device and is known as the worst type of punishment in the history of humankind. It was used for punishment as well as interrogation. Many Spanish boots have come into existence, and there are different methods of pain infliction. Most of them were designed to crush, or at the very least, severely injure the wearer's foot or leg. One such boot would be made of wooden boards nailed together. They were specifically made to fit the individual who would wear them. Once the leg was enclosed between the boards, wedges would be hammered in to create an increase in pressure. This would continuously be tightened until the victim either confessed to a crime, gave crucial information, or lost consciousness. The newer variants included iron vices, much like the one that Lois wore. Sometimes they'd be armed with spikes that squeezed the appendage and created suffering for the wearer. One of the accounts of the boot torture device being used on a person dates back to 1668. Archbishop James Sharp was in a coach in Edinburgh when a man named James Mitchell approached a carriage and attacked Sharp. The bishop luckily survived, and the hunt for the assassin commenced. Mitchell wasn't captured until 1674 and was taken to a dungeon off the Scottish mainland. There, he was told that if he confessed to the attempted assassination, then his life would be spared. So in front of the court, the assassin confessed to the crime, only to find out that no one actually confirmed that they would spare his life. Mitchell then recanted his confession, which led him to being affixed with the Scottish boot, the Scottish version of the Spanish boot, that entailed the same sort of method with wedges and increasing pressure. He later wrote that it was an extreme inquiry of torture. He wrote at length about the torture that he endured, which happened on various occasions. Despite this, he never confessed to the assassination again. There existed various other methods of interrogation that made use of a boot, one of which placed the victim's legs inside a pair of boots that were then held above a flame or placed within a pair that was topped with scorching hot water or oil. Featuring in the image with Lois is a type of torture boot that was employed by the Spanish boot as well. This one, though, was attached to a crank, which when turned compressed the shackled foot, causing a crushing pressure, sometimes with spikes adorning the inner sole. Pictured here are the Rawlins Juniors, a baseball team that played and lost 4 times against the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars, the worst ball club that was ever established. This picture is particularly haunting, given the makeup of the opposing team. The Wyoming team was made up of criminals who were on the execution list. They were incarcerated for various crimes, including homicide and burglary. This image was produced in 1911, a time in which execution was still being used for higher-ranking criminals. But as long as the prisoners kept winning, the longer they got to evade the gallows. The All-Stars team looked like any other. They took team photographs decked out in uniforms with matching caps and gloves. The lineup consisted of a man convicted of homicide who was at the shortstop. A burglar was at the third stop, and Manning at first base was a man convicted of a harsher felony. Each individual, though, showed some aptitude for sport, hence their recruitment. On its surface, this new program was installed by a new warden, who had a keen interest in the game. But beneath that surface was corruption at its finest. The story of the controversial baseball team began during a time when the sport was sweeping across America. In Wyoming, several semi-pro and amateur teams began to pop up, and fans just couldn't get enough of it. The Wyoming State Penitentiary was established in 1901 in Rawlins. It was a gloomy lockup with no electricity or running water. It was a cold and miserable place for anyone to be incarcerated. Making matters worse was that Otto Graham, a millionaire businessman, was running it with the assistance of the then warden J.P. Henn. Initially, the inmates were set to manufacture brooms for Graham in a makeshift factory for 57 cents a day. Prisoners were kept half alive with mistreatment and starvation. After more than a decade, Governor Joseph Carey shut the whole place down and tapped County Sheriff Felix Alston as the new warden. Alston was the man with the baseball obsession, who certainly instilled the change that the governor was opting for. In this case, it was the institution's first ever baseball team. While the warden's intentions were mostly good in the hopes of boosting the spirits of the inmates and building morale, he didn't take something into account. The team was dangerous. Inmates ranged from ages 18 to 39, and the roster was fleshed from the likes of Joe Gazzardo, convicted of manslaughter, Eugene Rowan, convicted of assault, John Crotty, who found himself in prison for grand larceny, Sidney Potter, a forger, Frank Fitzgerald, who was convicted of breaking and entering, and Joseph Singh, incarcerated for homicide in the first degree. The pitcher was a man named Thomas Cameron, a 20-year-old coal miner with a rap sheet that included assaults of various types. The coach was George Saban, a man convicted of manslaughter. He was doing a 25-year stint for taking the life of a sheep herder using a firearm and setting another 2 individuals alight amid the Spring Creek raid. Despite how terrible the makeup of the All-Stars was, they were fairly good baseball players. In 1911, Daniel Kenneman, the owner of the Wyoming Supply Company, suggested that the convicts play a series against the Rawlins Juniors. Their first game commenced on the 18th of July in 1911, the day that Singh would be granted a stay of execution. The convicts defeated the Juniors that day at a score of 11-1. All in all, the All-Stars won 4 matches against the Juniors. Forcing inmates to play baseball in exchange for their lives wasn't the only issue in this program, though. The convict-filled sport was also feed a local interest, such as gambling. Later that year, heavier restrictions would be placed on the prison after a rash of escapes occurred that year. The Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars faded from existence. As for Singh, it turned out that his stay had been arranged by attorneys and was short-lived. He was to meet the gallows the following year, during which the Cabron County Journal noted that his steps were steady and he accepted his execution in such a manner that he was stamped a brave man. While this may look like an innocent photograph of an unknown individual's fingers, the story behind it is nothing short of shocking. It begins with a man born to the name Alvin Francis Karpovich, better known as Alvin Karpis. He was also nicknamed Creepy due to his haunting and sinister smile. Karpis was an American criminal who was prominent in the 1930s. He was deemed an enemy of the public and known for his alliance with the Barker Gang. This alliance became known as the Karpis-Barker Gang, which was one of the most formidable criminal organizations of its time. They exhibited no hesitation to take anyone's life, even that of innocent onlookers. They robbed numerous banks, hijacked deliveries, and turned to the works of kidnapping. In 1933, the group abducted a millionaire Minnesota man named William Ham. The ransom was a hefty $100,000. The kidnapping of Minnesota banker Edward Bremer Jr. brought them another $200,000. The group was led by Karpis, who had a photographic memory. The gang consisted of at least another 25 members. The FBI began hunting down this public enemy, tracking him down to Atlantic City in 1935. It was here that he almost met his violent demise, yet managed to escape. Karpis continued to commit his crimes and even pulled off a train robbery in Ohio, netting another $27,000. It wasn't this gangster's business dealings that made the images of his fingertips alarming, but rather what happened to those fingers amid the 1930s. During the era of gangs and outlaws, another underground business came into play. It was the plastic surgery of the underworld, which offered various modifications to these outlaws in an effort to protect them against law enforcement. This is precisely what happened to Karpis' fingers. The crime boss and Fred Barker, who was part of the Barker Gang, sought the assistance of Joseph Moran. He was known to stitch up mobsters and remove shrapnel following encounters with the police. Moran happily performed the fingerprint mutilation on the two in order to make identification a lot more difficult, especially at the crime scenes that trailed behind them and the scenes that were yet to come. But this mutilation didn't come without a painful cost. Often, it would entail a nasty method, such as sanding down, slicing, or using acid to burn the prints away. The image seen here is Alvin Karpis' altered fingerprints, which the FBI photographed upon his arrest just 1 year later in New Orleans. Alarmingly, this sort of practice is still going on even today. Serving as a stark contrast against this small town is a mysterious object jutting from the open ocean waters. It jumps from the waters of Port Saul Rocks, 2 kilometers from the coast of Brittany, France. It's the shipwreck of an oil tanker, Amoco Cadiz, and it's been protruding from the sea since 1978, where it remains today in a state of rust and decay. It was the 16th of March, 1978, when the oil tanker, owned by Amoco Transport Corp., and built in Spain, was on a voyage manned by an Italian crew. The vessel was Liberia registered, and in its belly, Amoco Cadiz held 223,000 tons of crude oil, as well as another 4,000 tons of bunker fuel. During the vessel's journey, the steering mechanism failed. It was never determined if there was an inadequate backup steering in place, or if the crew were just unsuccessful or untrained in their emergency backup controls. Upon the steering failure, though, Amoco Cadiz did receive help, but it came in the form of just one singular tugboat. The tug was called the Pacific, and its owners, as well as Amoco Cadiz's owners, wasted crucial time by haggling over the salvage contract. By the time the rescue attempt went into operation, it was too little too late. The Pacific headed out to the oil tanker and began tugging it to the shore. But this effort proved futile, given that the roughness of the waves had picked up by this point, resulting in the tow line snapping. By then, the ship was already out of the traffic lanes and making its way into French territory. As it made its way into the waters, the ship ran aground on Port Saul Rock, on the Breton coast, where it began to sink. The story should end there, with the ship sinking and tons of crude oil still concealed within. But instead, the French Navy decided that they didn't want this foreign vessel stationed in their waters, especially when small amounts of oil began to release. Instead of pumping the oil from the tanker, the Navy made use of depth charges to destroy the wreckage, causing it to break apart into 3 sections right in the English Channel, releasing 223,000 tons of crude oil all at once. This resulted in the largest oil spill ever known to mankind. The local politicians demanded immediate action to contain the disaster, but cleanup efforts were incredibly uncoordinated. Adding to the complications was the fact that the technology for oil cleanups wasn't very advanced at this point, and even with the experts at the front of the operation, attempting to contain the oil would be futile. Prior to the 1978 incident, the Torrey Canyon oil spill claimed the title of the worst environmental tanker disaster, which turned the sea black in 1967. The Amoco Cadiz oil tanker now holds the title for the world's worst maritime oil spill, which placed a darker mark on the environmental record of shipping. After the wreck, the French government opted to move the lanes away from the coast, and ships in trouble were required to notify the French Navy immediately, but the damage was already done. Amoco Cadiz now strikes from the sea as a shocking reminder of the worst environmental catastrophe and the largest loss of marine life in history. Teddy Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States and served from 1901 to 1909. While he showed interest in many sports and outdoor activities, he took a keen interest in hunting. Roosevelt was passionate about it. He enjoyed the thrill of tracking and chasing animals down before using his skilled marksmanship, bringing the chase to a violent end. During one long hunting trip in 1902 in Mississippi, the president was in search of a bear to hunt. But it was unproductive, and the group wasn't having much success. This prompted a guide to track down a bear and tie it to a tree, just so that Roosevelt would be able to capture something. The creature was old and injured, which allowed the guide to capture it with ease. Despite having taken the lives of countless animals prior, Roosevelt refused to do it. It was unsportsmanlike, according to him. This sudden change of outlook revered the president as a hero, even though the suffering bear's life had to be humanely ended anyway. News of this event spread quickly and captured the likes of Clifford Berryman, a cartoonist, who satirized the event in a cartoon. The drawing appeared in the Washington Post in November. A man named Morris Measham saw the satirical cartoon and decided to create a toy dedicated to the refusal to end the bear's life. It was called the Teddy Bear. But the odes to Roosevelt's heroic decision didn't end there. The next creation, pictured here, took on more of a creepy sight. It took the form of a silent film called The Teddy Bears, which was produced in 1907. The film is just 13 minutes long and centers around the tale of Goldilocks and the three bears. The film starts in reference to the fairy tale of Goldilocks, but ends with the political satire of the president. After Goldilocks invades the home of the three bears, she flees to the safety of Theodore Roosevelt, who then fires at the two adult bears. When Baby Bear came running along, he opted not to fire at him, and instead tied him up and led him to a house filled with stuffed teddy bears, which each of the three characters took and headed off with. This image was taken from the silent film, a time when costume making was in its youth. This made for a creepy image of oddly faced and upright bears lingering over Goldilocks, turning the children's story into a horror. The 22nd of November, 1963, was a day that shook the world. It was an event that was felt around the world, with many nations sharing America's grief. It was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It was in the midst of the Cold War when the president and his wife rode in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. The accused assassin was Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who embraced Marxism. Oswald, though, never stood trial because his life was taken while he was being transferred by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, who was absolutely distraught. He wasn't the only person affected by the ordeal. One image managed to encapsulate the feelings that traveled across the world, and news began to spread. The picture came from New York, and it was that of an unnamed woman's face, marred by pure shock and horror as she learned of the JFK assassination. Crowds began to gather in public places, while many openly wept. Traffic came to a halt as the news jumped from car to car. Schools all across the United States were dismissed early. The major television networks suspended their schedules and switched to news coverage. Each network was on air for 70 hours straight, which made it the longest uninterrupted news event in the United States. Stress was at an all-time high, since this event took place amid the Cold War. The nation felt as though they were balancing on the edge of a larger attack on the United States, and wondered if the assassination was just the beginning of it. In Germany, Lucien Heischler got news of the assassination while attending the return of a Fulbright student, and the cultural affairs officer gave a reception. In a matter of minutes, Berlin broke up. Theaters closed along with bars, restaurants, and movie houses. It was quiet and desolate. Heischler headed to a bunker room that was used for emergencies, and there he and military colleagues spent the night discussing protocol matters, occupying their minds. Africa was affected by the ordeal as well. William Roundtree from Sudan commented that the country felt a personal loss. Before the passing of JFK was confirmed, Sudanese people arrived at the chancery door, expressing their condolences through tears. In a matter of hours, every taxi would be traveling with a black banner attached to their radio aerial. It became evident that they had felt the loss of the president quite deeply. News arrived in Austria, France, the Netherlands, the USSR, Asia, Yemen, Japan, and Latin America. The world was in a state of fear, sadness, and shock. Many slumped in their seats in defeat. Others gathered and cried, and it was chaos. And that chaos and emotion could all be seen in the face of a stranger wandering the streets, newspaper clutched to her chest. Jutting from the greenery of the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania landscape is a facility that once confined the criminals of Philadelphia. The Holmesburg Prison was built in 1896 and formed part of the prison system of the city well into 1995. The 8215 Torresdale Avenue facility wasn't only teeming with inmates, but also with mistreatment, cruelty, and horror. After its closure, the facility became abandoned, decrepit, and worn. With its look of horror and its terror-filled past, Holmesburg would become the perfect spot for filming horror movies, such as the 1995 film Condition Red, the 1996 Up Close and Personal, and the 2000 film Animal Factory. Adding to the scenes of terror is a past swarming with trepidation. It wasn't the several major riots in the early 70s, or the hundreds of documented cases of assault on inmates that made this facility particularly notorious. What really marred the Holmesburg prison was a series of cruel experiments that were conducted on the living people that haunted the cells within. The Holmesburg prison experiments took on a controversial nature that lasted decades. It saw research into dermatology, pharmaceuticals, and biochemical weaponry, all at the expense of unfortunate inmates. Philadelphia's history has been marred by a lasting shame that was bestowed upon the city by Dr. Albert Kligman, the dermatologist. The horror-filled journey began in the early 50s, when the incarcerated people were given a monetary reward in exchange for being test subjects. The cash would either go toward bail money or be sent home to their families, whose lives were carrying on without them. Compared to any other prison job, the Holmesburg prison experiments paid the most. If inmates could pay 10% of the set bail amount, they could end their sentences. Consenting to the trials paved the way for freedom. The prisoners, though, were unaware of the terror that they would be consenting to. Upon Kligman's first visit to Holmesburg, he declared that he saw acres of skin, the same way a farmer would see a fertile field for the first time. It was just like that, the people were reduced to mere objects. Kligman's initial focus was on dermatological discoveries, but this would soon branch into something much worse. The experiments were extensive and invasive. The subjects were exposed to a variety of diseases, including herpes and staph. Chemicals and radioactive isotopes blistered their skin. Cosmetics were tested on them, along with psychoactive pharmaceuticals and even carcinogenic compounds. Kligman wasn't alone in this unethical act either. He received over 33 different sponsors, including that of the United States Army, DOW Chemicals, and Johnson & Johnson. Exposure to microwave radiation and carbonic and sulfuric acid caused erosion in the epidermis of victims. Their skin blistered and turned to leather. Dr. Albert Kligman may not be a household name today, but his products in the skincare industry did become well known. His popular developments included Retin A, a topical medication for the treatment of acne. The discovery, though, came on the backs of incarcerated individuals. These men maintained that their experiments were nothing short of unethical and torturous, a trial that would forever change their lives. As new interest in the Holmesburg experiments emerged, so did many victims. One such person was Irvin Moore, who'd been imprisoned for over 50 years. Moore learned of the tests and the monetary reward in 1969 during his sentencing. He was driven to take part in this practice because of the terrible realities of prison life, realities that compelled inmates to find other ways to support themselves. There were limited resources, fears for their families, and a necessity to maintain communication with them. Partaking in the test was the only plausible solution for some, and it would allow Moore to earn the much-needed money to buy a few items and send funds back home. But much like every other participant, he signed up without fully understanding the risks involved. When he asked about specific details on what they were required to inject or ingest, and if it would harm him, Moore was met with a vague response, with administrators telling him that everything was safe. This was a lie, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to enter something very dangerous. The tests commenced, and Moore would be faced with trepidation and a growing concern for his well-being. Despite this, the experiments began. One of the experiments that he and hundreds of other prisoners would endure was called the milkshake test. This was more of a lucrative experiment that would require the inmate to live in an isolated block and only eat a milkshake product, the ingredients of which were never disclosed to the subject. These products would be consumed 3 times daily for 6 months straight. One victim of this test, Yusef Anthony, had to undergo multiple surgeries to repair the damage that had been done as a result of this. Herbert Rice, who was also subjected to the milkshake test, also underwent other experiments that left him physically and emotionally scarred for the rest of his life. For 4 months on end, Rice's skin felt like leather after administrators put a radioactive compound on his back. Another test that he was subjected to required him to ingest a pill that was filled with a living organism. Leiris Jones, another inmate, became part of the trials, which resulted in scars and sores running along his neck and back. He went into Holmesburg as a kind, compassionate man, only to emerge violent and hostile. The topical tests and foreign consumptions weren't the worst of it. More gruesome accounts detailed how fragments of cadavers would be stitched on to other inmates. This was in an effort to determine if the fragments would regrow into functional organisms. They didn't. These trials forced inmates to feel less than human. Not only did the demonstrations affect the well-being of individual prisoners, but they actually affected whole blocks with the use of biological agents. This included poison ivy, poison oak, and Hong Kong flu. Other experiments sought to study how ringworms would affect a person's feet, and inmates were administered large amounts of fungi and had to wear boots for an entire week. Face creams, deodorant, toothpaste, eye drops, and liquid diets were among the tested products too. Bubble bath experiments caused blistering outbreaks and a sense of being on fire. Prisoners were also infected with herpes simplex and a wart virus. Others were subjected to long exposure to ultraviolet rays, as well as different types of yeast infections. Dioxin testing was among the harsher trials, and dosages were 468 times greater than company protocol. Mind-altering narcotics were used, with rumors detailing the involvement of LSD, pushing participants to insanity. Patients reported excruciatingly painful and scary symptoms during the entirety of the trials. Between 1951 and 1974, Kligman wreaked havoc on the bodies and minds of Holmesburg prisoners, only to advance his discoveries and garner partnerships with the world's leading pharmaceutical companies. Such companies sponsored tests like those that injected asbestos into the bodies of men and exposed them to the powerful herbicide known as Agent Orange. Alan Hornblum bore witness to the atrocities that had terrorized the prison. Even though he had stopped working there, he remained shocked at what he had seen. He was even more astounded to find that the atrocities had gone undocumented and unexposed, so he told the story himself through his 1998 novel Acres of Skin, revealing the 20 years of pure horror. It was the 27th of March, 1964, Good Friday, the launch of springtime winter in Alaska, and the day that many people looked forward to. For the residents, though, this would not be a very Good Friday at all. As the afternoon began to unfold, a small, sharp shake, followed by a rolling motion, signaled the release of pure havoc that erupted from the ground at exactly 5:36. The ground was alive, contorting and twisting beneath the feet of the town. It was a mega-thrust earthquake, and it showed no remorse as it ripped through Alaska. As the ground heaved, panic ensued. The Great Quake measured a striking 8.4 to 8.6 on the Richter scale, with a daunting peak of 9.2. It was the second largest earthquake on record, lasting a few minutes, shattering the tranquility of Anchorage. This day made history as the most powerful recorded earthquake in the United States and in North America. South Central Alaska crippled and cracked under the pressure of the shaking. The events released twice as much power as the 1906 quake that wrecked San Francisco, making for an unforgiving and chaotic scene. It was felt across 500,000 square miles in the Prince William Sound region, as ground fissures opened up and structures became uneasy. For 4 minutes and 38 seconds, the ground violently shook. 25 kilometers beneath the surface, the violent quake ruptured. Its epicenter was 120 kilometers from Anchorage and just 10 kilometers from the mouth of College Fjord, a place known for its breathtaking views, which now served as a contrast to the chaos. Anchorage sustained irreversible damage with destruction to houses, buildings, and infrastructure. Structures that once withstood the tests of time crumbled in an instant. As the uncontrollable forces of nature surged through the town, houses collapsed and buildings burst at the seams. The streets were filled with residents who attempted to flee their homes and seek safety. The havoc was not only due to the uncontrollable trembling the people felt beneath them, but also what would be unleashed just 4 minutes later. Landslides ripped through the region, taking houses that had stood there for generations and vital roads that connected communities, towering trees, and anything else in their paths with them. Some areas along the coastline near Kodiak and Hinchinbrook Island would rise 30 feet and be forced to stay this way permanently. Areas around Girdwood were confined to the south side of the Seward Highway as unforgiving waters flooded in, destroying any buildings on the north side of the passage. The earth continued to shift with ground liquefaction, dropping Girdwood and Portage by 8 feet. This forced reconstruction and fill to raise the highway above the now new high tide mark. In Port Valdez, underwater landslides were underway, taking 30 people with it when it prompted the collapse of the Valdez City Harbor. The terror, though, was not over yet. The aftershocks gave rise to multiple tsunamis, one of which was a tectonic tsunami that rose 27 feet tall. It hovered dauntingly above the Chenega village, claiming another 23 lives out of the 68 residents who lived there. Survivors miraculously outran the monstrous wave and found solitude on higher ground. 20 more local tsunamis emerged, contributing to further destruction. By this time, the waves had already enveloped and destroyed the coastal towns of Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island, and the Kenai Peninsula. 3 hours after the quake, a 4.5-foot tall tsunami made landfall in Canada before hitting Port Alberni and taking 55 homes with it, while damaging over 300 more. Major ports of Whittier, Seward, and Kodiak were ripped from the shores with post-quake tsunamis, fires, and subsidence. Near Cordova is the Copper River, exceeded by the $1 million bridge that gave way to the elements. While Valdez wasn't totally destroyed, the town was forced to move to higher grounds some years later, 4 miles west of its original site. The quake subsided, and the waters retreated, but no sighs of relief were heard. The trouble wasn't over yet. For another 3 weeks, Alaska was plagued by thousands of aftershocks. In the first day, 11 massive aftershocks were documented. They reached a magnitude greater than 6.2. Another 9 major shocks were recorded during the 3-week course. It wasn't until more than a year later that the aftershocks went unnoticed. By this time, though, the damage had been done, with the Good Friday earthquake claiming more than 100 lives and displacing many others. Many aspects of the event could have been exasperated with minor changes in detail. If it had come just a day earlier, the toll would have been much greater, since schools and workplaces would be in full operation. If it had struck at high tide rather than low tide, the coastal damage would have been far worse. Alaska's governor estimated that the destruction would cost $750 million to replace, rebuild, and reconstruct the affected areas. Waterfront communities, whose main source of income was fishing and shipping, had lost their means of livelihood. 50,000 square miles of land had seen significant damage. The iced-over rivers were buckled and lakes were cracked within the 100,000 square miles. The severe convulsions that enveloped Alaska suggested that the event occurred on a fault line of considerable length. This would be the first time that Alaska was struck by a disaster of this magnitude in a highly populated area. They had very limited resources to aid them in recovery efforts. The city of Anchorage and the Alaska State Housing Authority pulled together a team of 40 geologists, scientists, and soil experts, and engineers to assess the extensive damage. The team, though, only found conflict when they were met with the local developers and downtown business that wanted their town immediately rebuilt. The U.S. Army were able to re-establish communications with the lower states and deployed troops to assist the citizens. Just a day after the earthquake mercilessly struck the region, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared Alaska a major disaster area. Relief supplies were shipped to the area using rescue helicopters and military airlift. These deliveries amassed 2,570 pounds of food and supplies. A journalist, Jeannie Chance, stayed on the Kenny Air over Anchorage for more than 24 hours. She served as the voice of the safety office, coordinated response efforts, connected resources to communities in need, passed messages between loved ones, and helped reunite families. The sheer violence of nature was on full display, leaving behind a desolate terrain. In both figurative and literal ways, the Good Friday earthquake completely altered the Alaskan landscape, leaving a permanent mark on its history. It was a cataclysmic event whose aftermath can only be explained in images that documented it, with houses reduced to shrapnel, swollen land, and roads minimized to rubble. It was June of 1962, a day like any other for the workers of a United States textile mill that blended into the industrious town. Employees bustled in through the doors and assumed their positions to begin their daily tasks in the dressmaking department. The 62 workers, 59 of which were women and 3 of which were men, were seemingly unaware that their everyday routine was about to take a sickening and disturbing turn. A new fabric shipment had just arrived with a vibrant batch of textiles. The shipment, though, was about to unleash an unforeseen terror in the factory. Moments after the packages were opened and stored in their designated areas, an inexplicable malaise gripped the employees, with disturbing symptoms that would become a collective nightmare. Numbness in the hands and feet signaled the start of it, with bouts of nausea and rashes spreading across the skin and severe dizziness, leaving some workers incapacitated. It felt as though a dark plague had been unleashed in the factory, and it became one victim after the other. The workers, who had no idea what was happening, began to speculate. They wondered if the strange symptoms were caused by the bite or sting of an insect that had gone unnoticed with the fabric shipment. Talk of a bug loose in the factory stirred into paranoia, erupting into a fast-acting epidemic, and hastily named the June bug plague. Media outlets seized the opportunity to report on the gripping stories with sensational headlines, instilling fear in the public. As word circled through the community, company physicians, entomologists, and experts from the United States Public Health Service Communicable Disease Center flocked to the factory, The teams united in a desperate search for the alleged toxic bug that had seemingly hospitalized many of the workers, leaving doctors scratching their heads. They searched every inch of the mill, armed with various pieces of equipment, but still there was no sign of any insect that was capable of this sudden outbreak of illness. During this time, back at the hospital, doctors were still trying to diagnose their patients. When various tests gave them no answers, they decided to treat the symptoms individually, which further clouded the strange situation. Frantic workers awaited answers to the bizarre occurrences that began in the textile factory, as more from the same mill began to pour in. Nurses reported a stream of similar symptoms with dizziness and discomfort. As more research was conducted into the event, some of which enlisted the help of psychologists, new information emerged. The epidemic was confined to this specific group of just 62 workers. With no improvement in an effort to understand what was going on, the psychologists came to interview the workers and unravel the mindset of those affected. These careful interviews discovered that 90% of those employed at the factory worked the same shift. Many of them had clocked overtime, sharing not only the same schedule, but also the same daunting disease. At least 50% of the affected workers began experiencing their symptoms only after the media covered it. 59 of the 62 workers were part of the first shift, 58 of whom would spend their working day cramped in the same area of the factory. The overwhelming pattern certainly raised some eyebrows and sparked a discussion of suggestibility. The sick employees began taking some time off to allow for recuperation, and the government was focusing on the factory, trying to understand the epidemic before things got out of hand. Fear became a palpable presence in the community, both inside and outside the factory walls. An invisible enemy was lurking around, seeking its next victim. Every sensation felt was second-guessed, imagining that with every itch or wave of nausea, a great affliction lingered. Further research still led to no evidence of any insect that could be responsible for the reported symptoms. Further adding to the mysterious disease, not a single one of the employees had a visible bite mark or sting, or anything that indicated an insect bite. The disease appeared to have manifested from thin air, and without clarity of its origins, panic began to set in. Days became weeks, and the strain became evident. Not only had the physical ailments escalated, but the entire ordeal had given rise to psychological pressure. Psychologists continued their interviews, which would become a turning point for the epidemic. During the interviews, they discovered that many of the workers were struggling with high stress levels in their daily lives, which was only aggravated by the fast-paced demands and cramped conditions. The employees voiced concerns about job security, especially since the factory had only opened recently. This resulted in a poorly organized working situation and an influx of textile workers. Employees were running tight schedules with high expectations, which only added to the tension. This heightened stress in the workplace ultimately led to an unforeseen diagnosis. Each conversation with medical experts seemed to confirm a pattern. The inexplicable illness seemed to hold its grasp on the 62 workers, which may have been the work of psychological torment and not of a physical nature. The June bug epidemic became a classic case of mass hysteria, the prime example of how suggestibility could lead to very real and very distressing outcomes. While fear coursed through the factory and permeated the consciousness of the public, the United States Public Health Service realized there was no real threat to be found, attributing the illness that swept through the factory to social contagion. Amusement parks are supposed to be fun-filled, family-friendly adventures and havens of pure joy. Often, though, dark secrets lurked within. The mid-1900s was a time when entertainment was a must. Many attractions popped up all over the globe, drawing in tourists and locals for some joyous events. Fun houses, bumper cars, Ferris wheels, carousels, roller coasters, and haunted houses were among the most sought-after attractions. Families lined up in queues, waiting in suspense for a thrilling experience. It was also the late 1900s that saw a spark in TV screen pleasures, with horror movies and chilling shows captivating the audiences. On the odd occasion, these two worlds collided. It was December 1976 when the Universal Studio film crew headed for the Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California. preparations were underway to accommodate an episode of The $6 Million Man, a TV series about an astronaut turned crime-fighting android. The location of filming would take place in the Laugh in the Dark attraction, a spooky ride that sent hair standing on edge. The plan was for Steve Austin, the honorable and pricey character, to ride along the tracks in one of the cars. Dancing in the shadows above were the ghouls, skeletons, and demonic dummies. Fluorescent reds made it all the more fear-inducing. Little did the crew know that they were in for a lot more than they bargained for. The episode was for the 4th season of the show, titled Carnival Spies. The scene at Laugh in the Dark follows an evil spy who's at odds with the superhero inside the attraction. Scattered in the scene were the automatic pieces that would deliver frequent pop-up scares, the perfect arrangement for the show. In between each scene, the art director would restage the props and spruce up the set. During one particular sprucing up, the employee spotted a mannequin hanging in the corner. It would be sent swaying about during the rush of rickety carts going by. He reached for its arm to restage the dummy, but a dry snap made him freeze. The arm had broken right off in his hand. At first, this wasn't too concerning, and it could certainly be reattached given that it was just a prop. As he looked at the dismembered limb, though, the employee's face became a lighter shade of pale when he saw what looked like the remains of a real person peering out from the desiccated skin. The mannequin, doused in glow-in-the-dark paint, was no mannequin at all, but was once a very much alive man. The brakes were hit on the production, with the police and firefighters swarming the attraction. The police then had paramedics on their way after reporting a case of severe dehydration. Disturbingly, when the paramedics arrived, they consumed the scene with laughter. This was not a case of severe dehydration, but rather a corpse that had been dangling from the fake rafters. The petrified remains were sent to the Los Angeles coroner's office to undergo examination. The examiner discovered that this once able-bodied man had been reduced to a withered mummy that had sustained much wear and tear. He'd been subjected to high winds and the loss of several digits. A hole was found in the back of the neck, used to accommodate the noose that held him to the rafters. Examiners noticed a strange yellow goo emitting from the drilled hole. It was embalming fluid. The only clues to figuring out who the man was were recovered in the mouth, taking the form of tickets to the Museum of Crime. There was also a penny dating back to 1924. With these discoveries, the mummy's ante-mortem career unraveled. The deceased man, formerly mistaken for a mannequin, was in fact Elmer McCurdy, an outlaw who was prominent in the early 1900s. McCurdy was the mischievous vagabond who robbed a train in Oklahoma and took his $46 in stolen riches and 2 jugs of whiskey to a barnyard on the border of Kansas. Police were in hot pursuit of him, which ended in firearm combat in the hay. Following his demise, McCurdy would embark on quite the adventure that would ultimately end in the hands of an unsuspecting TV crew employee. Upon his passing, the body was taken to a funeral home in Pawhuska. But when it was unclaimed, the undertaker saw this as an opportunity to score some extra cash and embalmed him. The undertaker allowed visitors to view the embalmed individual only if they placed a nickel in his mouth. 5 years into the scheme, a carnival man arrived at the funeral home and claimed to be a relative of the deceased. He was, of course, lying, and McCurdy ended up being the attraction of a traveling carnival. For years, the outlaw would travel through carnivals and other attractions until one unfortunate mix-up. In 1949, the demand for such spectacles had waned, and the mummy would end up being stored in a Los Angeles warehouse. For 20 years, he languished there until 1968, when the petrified remains were sold to a Hollywood wax museum. The museum closed later that year, and McCurdy ended up being mixed up with actual wax figures and sold to the New Point amusement park, advertised as a wax figure and painted with fluorescent red. For 60 years, he'd be passed around from carnival to museum to storage, until eventually he was snatched up by the Pike amusement park, waiting to be uncovered and waiting to terrorize the finder. In February of 1977, the Guthrie, Oklahoma City Council decided to bury the remains of Elmer McCurdy. He was laid to rest in the Boot Hill section of Summit View Graveyard, alongside 3 other outlaws. The discovery of the mummy hung from the rafters was a harrowing experience that instilled an everlasting terror in the consciousness of that film crew employee, whose stomach dropped at the sight of muscle, tissue, and carcass. The sound of the dry snap forever instilled in his mind. It was the early 1960s, a time when the Soviet Union was already overshadowing the United States in the space race. By this time, they had not only sent their first satellite into orbit, but had also launched a person into the abyss. Feeling the weight of urgency, America needed to act fast and propel one of its own into the unknown. Luckily for them, by 1959, John Herschel Glenn Jr. had accumulated 9,000 hours of flying time, 3,000 of which were in jets. He was the perfect candidate for the Mercury astronaut that America was looking for. Glenn was assigned to the NASA Space Task Group that year, and soon became part of the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center. In 1961, he served as a backup pilot for Alan Shepard, the first American in space. He also served as a backup for Virgil Grissom. As 1962 approached, a storm began to brew. Glenn wouldn't be serving as anyone's backup this time, but would rather be embarking on his very own journey, becoming the first American to orbit the Earth. While this would allow the US to be placed ahead in the race, it was still an unnerving prospect. Sending the most capable of astronauts into the void has always been a gamble. Anything can go wrong at any given moment. On the 20th of February, 1962, citizens across America held their breath as astronaut Glenn squeezed into the claustrophobic confines of the Friendship 7 spacecraft. Suspense rose in his stomach with several delays, which forced Glenn to spend at least 4 hours in the capsule, still at ground level. But at 9:47 that morning, the countdown finally reached 0, and the Atlas rocket engines thundered into ignition. In just 4 seconds, the vehicle rose from the pad, leaving behind a scorching pillar of flames and exhilaration in the pit of the astronaut. Another 2 minutes elapsed, allowing the rocket's booster engines to cut off, with the Atlas propelling the capsule using just the single sustainer engine. 5 minutes into the flight, the sustainer cut off, and the Friendship 7 detached. All had gone according to plan, and Glenn was now in orbit. He would go on to rocket 160 miles above the planet, at a face-melting speed of 17,500 miles an hour, only to burst into the great nothing, a sea of darkness. This experience placed national pride on the line, along with the country's confidence to compete with its rivals. The Atlas launch vehicle propelled the Friendship 7 up, which would allow Glenn to circle the Earth 3 times. The thrilling flight would last 4 hours and 55 minutes. The tension was ever growing back at the Mercury Control Center in Cape Canaveral as the engineers monitored the situation. Flight Director Christopher Kraft maintained an eye over the mission, enveloped in risk and uncertainty, ensuring that nothing goes wrong. This time around, Glenn had his own backup. It was M. Scott Carpenter, who served as the capsule communicator. This was the one person at the Mercury Control Center who would communicate with the astronaut in orbit. Global tracking situations allowed the team at MCC to monitor the spacecraft's direction. The Friendship 7 had turned to fly with its heat shield in the direction of the flight. Glenn could see the state of California from where he was. He watched as the booster slowly tumbled from view, which took 8 minutes. The thrilled astronaut would now witness his first orbital sunset and the phenomenon known as fireflies, where ice particles are illuminated by the sun, making for a striking experience. All systems were in operation, and after concluding his first orbit, Glenn was a go for his second. It was here, though, that fate decided to intervene, and disaster emerged from the shadows. As he passed over Cape Canaveral at the beginning of Orbit 2, a spine-chilling warning echoed through the control room. It was a signal showing that the craft's landing bag had deployed much too early. The landing bag is used to cushion the impact when the craft re-enters the atmosphere and makes a landing in the waters below. The premature deployment of the bag meant that the heat shield was no longer in place, a crucial aspect for re-entry, as it would ultimately prevent Glenn from being burnt to a crisp. Without it, his fate would be exactly that. Ground control advised the astronaut to ensure that the landing bag was switched into the off position. As they tried to figure out what to do to prevent total obliteration, Glenn was now on his third orbit. He was instructed to place the switch into the automatic position, but no one had told him of the warning signal that was received. After hearing this instruction, the astronaut, now filled with dread, figured out what the issue was and reported that he heard no bumping noise or any other indication that the landing bag was deployed. The controllers theorized that the signal was faulty, but they couldn't know for sure until the Friendship 7 was back in the atmosphere and making the face-melting dive into the ocean. The third orbit was now complete, and the spacecraft needed to re-enter Earth. Uncertainty barreled through America as the craft ripped through the atmosphere. The descent was fraught with pure terror, with the addition of a radio blackout caused by the buildup of gases. For 4 minutes, Friendship 7 sped through the atmosphere, and Glenn described the re-entry as a fireball. The astronaut descended and watched burning chunks fly past his window. Was it the critical heat shield, the only thing keeping him from burning? The thought was paralyzing, and no one knew for sure until it was in the water. Glenn controlled the vehicle's altitude during the entry, which exhausted all fuel supply. The parachute was deployed at 28,000 feet, which was earlier than anticipated. The craft stabilized and slowed. A splash in the Atlantic signaled Glenn's landing. It bobbed just 800 miles away from Cape Canaveral. The destroyer, USS Noah, was sent to retrieve the vessel from the water. Sailors had spotted Friendship plummet into the sea. The threatening recovery took 21 minutes. Inside the hot capsule, Glenn blew open the hatch, revealing a perfectly intact, unscathed astronaut. There was no doubt that the trained astronaut's descent was a harrowing experience, with the circulating uncertainty in the minds of both Glenn and the control room. The moment of heroism and solitude had turned into a sinister ordeal, an event that serves as a reminder of the thin line between bravery and annihilation. Gorse Hall in Greater Manchester is a collection of 2 houses that sit on over 35 acres of land. While these houses and their grounds are a source of history and natural beauty, there is a dark history that lies behind these doors. In the early 1900s, George Harry Storrs and his wife Maggie lived in the Gorse Hall after inheriting a successful business from George's father, William. Their marriage was the talk of the town, but for all the wrong reasons. When the two had gotten married, Harry was 30 and Maggie was 35. And in the 1900s, this was considered a late age to marry, with most people holding the belief that if you weren't married by your early 20s, people would view you as undesirable. The marriage was also a loveless one, and shortly after they had gotten married, George began having an affair with Maria Hull. Maria was employed by one of George's friends, Robert Innes, and was in charge of their daughter's education. George frequently visited Robert's house and became fast friends with Maria. Their friendship quickly blossomed into a romance, and locals began whispering that they had seen George and Maria walking around Stamford Park together. These rumors came to a head on a chilly February evening in 1907, when Maria mysteriously disappeared. 3 weeks later, her body was found in a frozen-over canal, and the coroner determined that her demise was of her own doing. Historical records from the time point to the fact that Maria was a strict Lutheran, was possibly pregnant, and that the baby was George's. Due to her religious devotion, many believe that shame and embarrassment drove her to her end. But for George, the nightmare was just beginning. George began receiving anonymous threatening letters, and on September 10, 1909, an intruder made their way into his Gorse Hall home and threatened him. Thankfully, George was able to subdue the intruder, and following this event, the police offered their protection and suggested that George should have a bell fitted to his home to ring in case of another emergency. November 1st, 1909 was the day of local elections across much of the UK, and as such, the police and other towns across Greater Manchester were needed to enforce order at the polling stations. Whoever was plotting against George knew that the police would be preoccupied on November 1st and used it to their advantage. While the police were busy controlling crowds of anxious voters, the intruder slipped into George's Gorsehall home once more. Mary Evans, the cook, noticed someone standing by the kitchen door. At first, she mistook the man for one of the servants, but as the man got closer, she quickly realized what was happening. She screamed out, "There's a man in the house." George quickly sprang into action. As the two men wrestled, Maggie ran towards the bell, ringing it as loud as she could. But by the time the police arrived, it was too late. Shortly after 10 p.m., George Harry Storrs was pronounced deceased, and the police began their investigation. At first, witnesses said that the intruder looked like Cornelius Howard, one of Maggie's nephews. Howard was arrested and put before a court. However, the landlord of the Ring a Bells pub testified that Howard had been at the pub all night playing dominoes. Due to a lack of evidence and solid alibi, Howard was acquitted. Another man by the name of Mark Wilde was also arrested and questioned for Storrs' case. However, again, he was acquitted by the jury. Since 1909, George's case has sat cold and continues to baffle experts and investigators. For 20 years, the Chicago Fire Department was haunted by a bizarre mystery that nobody was able to explain. On one of the windows of the Chicago fire station remained a visible handprint, no matter whether it was cleaned with soap, water, ammonia, or other harsh chemicals, it stayed put. It wasn't until the firefighters put two and two together and realized that the handprint had possibly belonged to Francis Levy, who had been cleaning that window on the day that he foresaw his demise. On April 18, 1924, Francis Levy showed up for work as usual, but his colleagues noticed that something was off. Francis was described by his colleagues as a dedicated firefighter with a charming nature, but the Francis that they saw before them was the total opposite. Instead of greeting them with a large grin, he grunted and appeared very sad. For a few moments, he stood in silence as he cleaned the large window before turning to his colleagues and making a disturbing announcement. Without warning, Francis broke out of his silence and told his fellow firefighters that he had a very bad feeling, a feeling that today would be his last day on Earth. Not soon after, a call came into the station, and the fire crew assembled and drove to Blue Island Avenue, where a fire was raging through a 4-story building. As the firefighters made their way through the building, Francis became trapped at the bottom floor after the roof had caved in. Francis, along with 8 other men, sadly lost their lives that day, and the weight of his mysterious premonition and the situation rested heavily on the shoulders of the surviving firefighters. April 19th came around, and the firefighters returned to work only to see a mysterious handprint on the window that Francis had cleaned the day before. They tried to wipe it off, but it wouldn't budge. They grabbed all manner of cleaning supplies in an attempt to clear it away, but it stayed put. For 20 years, the firefighters attempted to clean the handprint to no avail. It became somewhat of a local legend, and firefighters in the station were convinced that it was somehow paranormally connected to Francis. The window in question was smashed in 1944 by a paperboy throwing a newspaper at it, but that doesn't mean that the mystery is solved. The mysterious handprint of Francis Levy has become infamous in Chicago, but we're still no closer to solving the mystery. At 8:15 p.m. on February 19, 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez was rushed into the emergency department of the Riverside General Hospital. Gloria was wheeled into Trauma Bay 1, where medical staff began attending to her right away. She had been admitted with severe heart palpitations and was presented with some very concerning symptoms. She was confused and her breathing was becoming very irregular. Medical staff quickly learned that Gloria was suffering from stage 4 cervical cancer, and did everything they could to stabilize her and make her as comfortable as possible. She was administered a cocktail of drugs to both sedate her and to get her heart beating at a regular pace, while respiratory therapist Maureen Welch used an ambu bag to get air into her lungs and stabilize her breathing. It was while Maureen was administering this treatment that she noticed a bizarre, oily sheen on Gloria's body. Without having time to react, Maureen stood aside as Gloria was defibrillated to stop her heart and get it beating properly again. The medical staff performing the defibrillation also noticed the strange sheen and commented that it gave off a fruity, sickly garlic odor. After Gloria had been defibrillated, Nurse Susan Kane drew a blood sample from her and immediately noticed a strong chemical smell emanating from the vial. She passed the sample to Maureen to see if she could identify the smell. In an interview for Discovery.com, she said, quote, "I thought it would smell like chemotherapy, the way blood smells putrid when some people are taking some of those medications. Instead, it smelled like ammonia." Before anyone in the room could react, members of the team who had attended to Gloria began fainting and dropping to the floor. Others began complaining of a burning sensation and a foul smell. Countless members of staff had collapsed from the toxic fumes given off by Gloria, and numerous others complained of strange symptoms. The emergency room was evacuated, with patients being attended to under the lights of the car park. Meanwhile, Trauma Bay 1 was sealed off, and brave doctors stayed behind to tend to Gloria. Despite their best efforts, Gloria passed away shortly after. Out of 37 of the medical staff present in the emergency room that night, 23 of them had suffered from the toxic fumes emitted by Gloria, and 5 of them had even been admitted to the hospital with their injuries. Julie Drudzinski, a student nurse, was the worst affected and spent over 2 weeks in intensive care, battling apnea, pancreatitis, and avascular necrosis. Julia underwent an autopsy, but the coroner failed to find anything that explained the bizarre events of February 19th. Following the verdict, biological samples taken from Gloria were sent to the Forensic Science Center at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Here, the analytical chemists found dimethylsulfone, known as DMSO2, that's formed when DMSO, known as dimethyl sulfoxide, is mixed with oxygen. The team at Lawrence Livermore put forward the suggestion that Gloria had been using DMSO as a home remedy for pain. DMSO is a solvent that's used for degreasing, but it's also known as an alternative topical pain medication. It's also available in a solid form and has a strong garlic smell. They further concluded that when Gloria was given oxygen, the DMSO and oxygen combined to create DMSO2. Then the electric shocks from the defibrillation converted the DMSO2 into DMSO4, a toxic compound that is a colorless, oily liquid and smells like onions. When DMSO comes into contact with human tissue, it's extremely hazardous, and it's believed that DMSO4 is responsible for the bizarre symptoms experienced by the staff that day. There's just one problem with this theory, and that's the fact that Gloria's family deny the claims that she was using DMSO for pain relief. They testified that they'd never seen Gloria use this, and she'd never talked about it before. Numerous other theories exist surrounding the events of February 19th, but none of them have come close to fully explaining what happened that day. Gloria Ramirez was buried at the Olivewood Memorial Park, and while her friends and family remember her for who she was, she is simply known to the world as the Toxic Lady. Since 2013, a mysterious figure, known only as Le Loyan, has been spotted walking through a wooded area in Switzerland. The figure can be seen silently walking through the area in a boiler suit, camouflage cloak, and a gas mask, adding an ominous twist. It doesn't speak and doesn't seem to acknowledge passers-by, and the police have stated that the person does not appear to be aggressive or dangerous. Despite the police issuing that statement, the residents report seeing the strange creature walking the same route every day at the same time, and standing in the bushes, watching as the residents go about their daily routines. Marianne Declue described her creepy encounter with the person, saying, quote, "It was a rainy Sunday. He had a cap, a dark cloak, and a gas mask. What could possibly be running through his head? I don't know, but it was unforgettable and unpleasant. I hope I don't run into him again." In 2013, a newspaper posted what they claimed was the first ever photo of Leloyan. Shortly after this sighting and rare photograph, a note appeared that read, quote, "The risk of a hunt for the beast." The note was allegedly written by the mysterious man and detailed how he had taken his own life, leaving behind his will and belongings. He also accused the newspapers of threatening his existence by publishing the photo, causing him to escape and abandon his daily walks that he referred to as happiness therapy. As of 2021, we're still unsure as to whether Leloyan is alive or who he even is. Swiss authorities want to get in contact with him to ask him some questions and put the public at ease. Unless he comes forward or there is new evidence, we may never know the true identity of this humanoid creature. Caronia is a picturesque village located in Sicily that is home to around 200 people. Life for the residents of Caronia is often quiet and uneventful. But in 2003, their small village was struck by a bizarre phenomenon that scientists are still trying to explain to this day. It started on December 23, 2003, when Antonino Pezzino's TV blew up. This small detail set off a chain reaction of weird events. Next, fuse boxes, air conditioners, and other electrical appliances were mysteriously catching fire. Other residents of the small village began reporting that a stack of wedding presents had mysteriously caught fire without cause. Everyone was baffled and quickly scrambled to find the source of the flames, but found nothing. Pieces of electrical equipment began spontaneously catching fire throughout the village. Antonino told Newser that he had rewired all of his appliances, but the fires continued. Even when the power was cut to the village, these mysterious fires kept popping up. By March of 2004, over 92 separate fires had been reported, and Antonino said, quote, "It's like we're living in a microwave." Later in 2014, the fires mysteriously popped up again, but this time Antonino's 25-year-old son was arrested for the crimes. But people in the village have said that his son couldn't have been responsible for all of these mysterious fires that happened in 2003 and 4. There's no news of the outcome of Antonino's son's arrest, and the mystery of the Caronia fires continues to this day. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.